Video game preservation is important for the medium's artistic integrity, though it is unfortunately not something that the game industry itself prioritizes. Historically speaking, games have been made on various different pieces of hardware, and sadly console manufacturers often don't make newer systems compatible with older games, which is not optimal. Additionally, some first-party publishers, mostly Nintendo, are very selective on what games they port from older systems, save for a few ports or remasters here and there. And alone, all of these factoids are issues. They are problems, but when combined, all of these problems create a clusterfuck of confusion for those who actually desire to play one of these older titles. It makes trying to play certain past games an arduous task, at least when playing them legally. Illegally is another matter. Regardless though, the act of trying to play a game from an older console generation can be a royal pain in the ass that costs a lot of time and money, especially for games less likely to receive any meaningful ports or remasters down the line, i.e. the games that aren't the Zeldas or the Marios of the world. Games like the classic Spider-Man 2 or Ape Escape, which are games that are still only available on the PlayStation 2, Xbox, or exclusively on the PlayStation 1, meaning that to play a lot of old games legally, you need to buy old consoles and games that are no longer in production, or in Nintendo's case, possibly overpay for a subscription service in order to play a paltry selection of classic N64 titles. And honestly, neither of these options are the easiest or most customer satisfactory way to play older games, especially compared to the legally murky yet cheaper avenue of emulation, piracy, or fan-modded PC versions. The legal way is overall a hassle, and that's even without discussing how games can get delisted or how virtual storefronts and older consoles get shut down, because honestly that should be a crime and Nintendo should be convicted because they're guilty as fuck. And ultimately, whether we are discussing the ability to access older titles, the fact that titles get delisted, or in how virtual storefronts get closed, this is why game preservation is so critical. There needs to be an archive of older titles that gamers can access with ease. And yes, I know that's easier said than done. After all, there's a lot of IP rights finagling and technological barriers here, but there still needs to be a catalog of these video games anyway. Being able to access these games would be good for the health of the medium. And while sure, some publishers and console manufacturers like Microsoft prize backwards compatibility and have a great library of old and new games with its Xbox Game Pass subscription, that company is the exception rather than the norm. In fact, back in 2021, Xbox executive Phil Spencer said, "My hope, and I think I have to present it that way as of now, is as an industry, we'd work on legal emulation that allowed modern hardware to run, within reason, older executable, allowing someone to play any game." End quote. But the operative word there is hope, because when it comes to preserving gaming's artistic integrity, the medium's rights holders overall remain unconvinced, meaning that there still needs to be a simpler way to play older games that were released from every single publisher over the past 30 or 40 years. Because as of right now, trying to play an older game is a shit show on par with Halo Season 1. And from a customer's perspective, this does not best respect the industry's history. It does not respect the artistry. However, modern game development trends have made the purpose of archival even more difficult, mostly in the form of live services, i.e. games as a service, i.e. GaaS. See, live services are online multiplayer games that are meant to keep players reeled in long term. They are games that are either meant or can only be played online, and often feature free-to-play style economies, featuring microtransactions, loot boxes, battle passes, and etc. And in theory, there's a lot of money to be made with these types of titles. After all, Fortnite, Apex Legends, Destiny 2, and other games are making money hand over fist, and with that, AAA publishers have heavily focused on these titles over the last few years. It's the main type of game that they release these days, but there is a problem, mostly in the form of how the market is way oversaturated with these types of games. There are way too many of these titles and not enough time to play all of them long term, which is an issue seeing as that's what these games are supposedly designed to do. They're meant to hook the player in for a long time, but unfortunately there's so many of these types of games vying for the customer's attention that there's only so many live service games that can have stratospheric success, because truly, while live services are designed to be time and money sinks, the player only has so much free time and money to spend on these games. They can only play and pay a few of them so much. This is why many live services are dying unceremonious deaths, closing their doors for good. Hell, many of these games have been axed in 2023 alone. Yes, in just a month and a half into this new new year, there are already enough dead live services to inspire an in memoriam list at an end-of-year award ceremony, because there's a lot of dead or dying live services here. There are a lot of past gas. Please laugh at my non-funny jokes. Games like Apex Legends Mobile, Battlefield Mobile, Chocobo GP, Babylon's Fall, Rumbleverse, Crossfire X, Knockout City, Crime Site, Echo VR, and Marvel's Avengers are all either closed down or will be closing down in the months ahead, making these games either unplayable or not played online in the way that they were meant to be played, though with the caveat that Knockout City will still have private servers available, which is a good consolation in that case. But still, this is awful because most of these games have only been out for a few years. Hell, some of these games like Chocobo GP and Babylon's Fall only released last year, meaning that anyone who did invest time or money into these games and their economies are now holding the piss bucket. They have been bamboozled, always a great word, because now at best these games won't be playable in their optimal setting, and at worst these games can't be played at all. It's just not optimal for the customer. Additionally, the situation regarding all these dying live services is not optimal for the purpose of video game archival either. As stated before, video game preservation is important so that future generations can play past games, but in the era of live services, this poses a problem. After all, these games are either meant to be played or can only be played online, yet so many of them are shutting down operations, closing down servers, meaning that they can no longer be played online, or in some cases, at all, which does pose a problem for those of us who believe that video game archival is important, for people who think having these games be playable in some fashion in the future is something that the video game industry should strive for. People like Doom co-creator John Carmack. Just last week, Carmack made an incredibly insightful statement to Upload VR. And while the statement is mostly in reference to the planned closure of Echo VR, which is owned by Meta, which is also a company that Carmack recently worked for, Carmack's statement is applicable to other only online games and or live services because he lays out a case as to what the developers of these types of games, i.e. online games or live services nearing the end of their life cycle, should do in terms of making sure that these games are playable in the future. Per the statement, even if there are only 10,000 active users, destroying that user value should be avoided if possible. Your company suffers more harm when you take away something dear to a user than you gain in benefit by providing something equally valuable to them or others. User value is my #1 talking point by far, but focus is pretty high up there as well, and opportunity cost is a real thing. Carmack's statement later continued, every game should make sure they still work at some level without central server support. Even when not looking at end-of-life concerns, being able to work when the internet is down is valuable. If you can support some level of LAN play for a multiplayer game, the door is at least open for people to write proxies in the future. Supporting user-run servers as an option can actually save on hosting costs, and also opens up various community creative avenues. End quote. Carmack's statement is a good sentiment. It comes from the perspective of respecting the industry's artistry, which is why I'm doubtful that many game publishers will take these words to heart, because while it may be culturally important as well as advantageous to the end user to make all these dying live service and multiplayer titles playable in some way, it's also not very profitable, and it also flies in the face of the industry's mistreatment and negligence towards its older titles, towards its own storied history, as seen with how the industry treats and has treated its past games that have existed prior to the live service era. Because sure, these companies might release ports or remasters and such, but publishers overall don't make their massive libraries of old games easily available to customers. If anything, every one of those aforementioned ports and remasters only exists due to the quote-unquote good graces of these game companies. And by good graces, I mean making money off of porting or remastering an old game, patting us, the audience, on the head, and fondly telling us, "Good night, little shits. Now be grateful for what you get." Because ultimately, that's the game industry's mentality here. They only re-release ports or remasters if it's monetarily beneficial for them. All the ports and such we receive are due to this. The vitality of games as a medium be damned. So yeah, I doubt that these publishers will ultimately change their attitude toward preserving their games anytime soon, even in the age of live services, because if the industry is hardly retroactive in their lackluster preservation efforts of past offline single-player games, then they sure as shit aren't likely to be proactive when it comes to live service titles. After all, with live service games, publishers already think that their titles will be a slam dunk. They have years worth of roadmapped content planned long before they even know if the game is even successful, because in their aim to hunt for financial whales, i.e. potential big spenders, their hunt for these aforementioned whales might sink their project faster than Captain fucking Ahab. They're just not thinking about the well-being of future live service games if they were to fail. And sure, there may be a few cases like with Knockout City and how that game will have private servers once it's shut down, but this is overall something that's not happening en masse. Knockout City is an outlier, meaning that the industry probably will not change their design philosophy towards these games anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong, of course, but the industry rarely passes up an opportunity to cut costs, and at the very least, they don't think long term. In regards to preserving older games or even making them accessible, they have shown time and time again that the medium's entire back catalog is worth very little to them, even when they can make these games accessible through worthwhile subscription services that can benefit both the company and the end user. Yet these companies mostly still don't do that, or at least not well enough, save arguably Xbox Game Pass. But still, that's once again the exception to the rule. And even then, that subscription service needs more original Xbox titles and Xbox 360 games, to be perfectly honest with you. And if gaming corpos are unwilling to make their offline games accessible, then what hope is there of publishers trying to make online games viable long past their expiration date? Because there just doesn't seem to be a uniform plan here, and ultimately, that's why many of these live service titles will be dying a painful death soon. Even more so than games in the past, live services don't have a long shelf life or viability, and there's very little monetary incentive to not design modern and or future live service titles in such a way that would ultimately hinder a game's longevity when a publisher ultimately moves on to newer projects and greener pastures. And ultimately, that means future gamers won't be able to play many of these dead or dying live services. Yes, not even those sailing on the internet's high seas will be able to access these games, because the SS download that booty ain't gonna allow you to play these dead games. Because when it comes to having playable versions of these expired titles, we're all gonna be pretty fucked out of luck. The titles will not be preserved. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of game preservation and John Carmack's statement. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make quick review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.